In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation online with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live and interact with our student-run Instagram at JFK Junior Forum for behind-the-scenes highlights. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests and Director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, Nancy Gibbs.
So cool to have a cheering section. Good evening. For those of you who haven't had a chance yet this semester to make it across the Charles Hotel, the Shorenstein Center over in Mount Auburn Street is focused on the intersection of media, politics, and public policy, which means we're basically looking at the quality of information in a free society. So a lot of that means working to get the best research into the hands of journalists to help newsrooms with hard questions that they're facing. All of that is about promoting good, high-quality information. But you'll understand why, at this moment in our history, a lot of our work is also focused on information contaminants, on bad information, on the ways in which information streams are polluted and poisoned. And leading that work for us is Dr. Joan Donovan, who's going to be moderating tonight. I think of Joan as the model of the scholar who bridges theory and practice with real-time, highly relevant research. She is building a casebook of 100 case studies in media manipulation that will not only be invaluable to researchers, it will be actionable intelligence for newsrooms and civil society leaders at a time when these questions and these challenges could not be more urgent. So the work that Joan and her team are doing, the work that we're doing at Shorenstein, the work that we're talking about in our convenings, in our classes, in our brown bag lunches, is work I hope you will all engage with us on, because I do believe it is critically important at this moment in our country's history. I'm so pleased that our inaugural forum event is on a topic that is this urgent and with a group of people that bring so much to these questions. And so please welcome Joan Donovan and her panel.
Thank you so much to Nancy and Seti Warren at the Shorenstein Center. It's been a pretty amazing sort of journey out of getting my PhD and doing some work at Data and Society in a nonprofit, and then ending up here where I grew up about 10 miles from here in Saugus. So, you know, it's a pretty big deal. My spouse has alerted my mother that there's a live stream. So, and you should tell your friends as well that there's a live stream tonight, so that I can fulfill my dream of getting out of Route 1 and being in Cambridge. Before we get started, we're going to do something that's not traditional within Cambridge and HKS, but I think it's a really important thing that we start to do here, which is a territorial acknowledgement. And so luckily today we have Erika Violet Lee, who's a writer, community organizer, and graduate student who creates and studies indigenous philosophy, embodied geographies, and decolonial epistemologies of desire in the future. Erika has worked with Idle No More, the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition, and the David Suzuki Foundation, among others, in the pursuit of indigenous feminist freedoms. She is part of the Cree tribe from Saskatoon and a member of the Thunderchild Cree Nation, currently enrolled in the master's program in social justice education at OISC at the University of Toronto. So Violet, if you'd come up here, and Erika Violet Lee, come up here and talk to us a bit about recognition and the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Joan. I don't want to turn my back to anyone, but Tansei, Erika Violet Lee, Nitsika-san, Misaskatoma Nignito-tsen. My name is Erika Violet Lee, and as a visitor from Neheo territory up north, I'm honored to deliver this land acknowledgement in support of this brilliant panel tonight. Thank you to the Harvard University Native American Program and Jason Paquino for their assistance with this acknowledgement. So often land acknowledgements can be tokenizing or absent altogether, so I tried my best to make this one a little different. We acknowledge the intertwined legacies of the devastation of transatlantic slavery and settler colonialism, which contribute to the creation and continued wealth of this university and to this nation. We acknowledge the reparations owed to Black and Indigenous communities and nations, and the impossibilities of return for generations past, and the ancestors in the room tonight as we fight together for better futures. We acknowledge that we're alive in an era of necessary resistance to preserve this planet and all of the beautiful creation that we have no doubt is worthy of the struggle. We acknowledge that the land on which Harvard sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Ginanes Komitin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erika. We really appreciate you being here. And Erika comes here. I'll talk to you a little bit about the workshop that we held today in a minute, but first I should introduce our panel tonight. So at the far end here, we have LaToya Peterson, who's a television veteran specializing in emerging technologies. She's an award-winning race and culture writer for major outlets like the New York Times, NPR, Jezebel, and Kotaku, as well as a 3-time judge for the World Video Game Hall of Fame. Named one of Forbes' magazine's 30 Under 30 Rising Stars in Media, she's best known for the award-winning blog racialicious.com, which used to publish about the intersection of race and pop culture. Her new endeavor, Glow Up Games, check it out, is a creative R&D studio building the future of interactive entertainment. In the center here, we have Dr. Khalil Muhammad, who's a professor of history, race, and public policy at HKS, and is the Susan Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He's currently leading a project at Shorenstein on institutional anti-racism and accountability, nicknamed the IRA Project. Please check out what they're doing. They've got some conference stuff and some talks coming up. And he's the former director of the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture. So thank you for coming down the street. No, I'm joking because he's been on sabbatical, and this is a very special occasion for us to have you here. And Rua Benjamin, who admittedly is one of my sort of academic idols. I aspire to be like you, and I've got a lot of work to do because you are an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she studies the social dimensions of science, technology, medicine, race, and power. She's the founder of Just Data Lab, and she released 2 amazing books, Race After Technology, which is solo-authored, and Captivating Technology, which is an edited collection of essays. And this is why I say I aspire to, but no one should expect me to be publishing 2 books anytime soon. Maybe one. Maybe one is ambitious. So welcome everybody here today. I want to welcome my classes here, so thank you for coming. It's really nice of you to show up because I made you. Just definitely make sure you see Jen for attendance. I'm not kidding. So tonight we're going to talk about the politics of difference and the rhetoric of inclusion. And we had a wonderful workshop today called Please Do Not Include Us, led by Digital Justice Lab's Nazma Ahmed and Sarah Un, they're both leading advocates on human rights and information security. And I want to thank you both for hosting this thoughtful event here at Harvard. And what we were able to do today was bridge product managers, journalists, data scientists, policymakers, and activists to think about the public conversations we should be having about the limits of inclusion as an unmitigated social good. And of course, acknowledging differences can be really discomforting, but the recognition of difference can also help us think differently about building intentional communities. And one of the sort of pain points of being in universities sometimes is that there's a lot of inclusionary rhetoric at the same time that we traffic in a lot of exclusionary politics. And so even as I'm convening this conversation here, I want to open with a provocation and a set of questions to think about, well, what can inclusion mean? And so when I'm talking about an inclusion and exclusion paradigm, I'm thinking about a few very recent examples. For instance, in July, there was public outcry against former Governor Rick Schneider getting a fellowship here. He resigned. Later this summer, MIT faculty and researchers were called out to respond publicly about funding given by Epstein. Several faculty resigned. And we're also in the midst of a culture shift related to technology and inclusion, as well as accountability. And while each of us felt some type of way about what could inclusion mean, we also are in some ways perplexed because some powerful people are being held accountable, but also that seems pretty rare. And so I want to open by asking, if you'd like to respond to this, what do you think about when you think about the politics of inclusion and exclusion within institutions or industry, and where do you see potentials for a power shift? And any one of you can jump in.
I'll just start by saying, with respect to the Snyder issue, that I just want to acknowledge that the individual who really galvanized public attention around that was Black feminist abolitionist Miriam Kaba. And so I just want to call forth the idea that people outside of the academy understand the stakes sometimes better than we do that are situated here. And for me, what that entire sort of organizing effort indicates is that, you know, people are ready and willing to hold a mirror up to these ideals that we give lip service to say you can't just put it on your website, you can't just invoke these ideas when your everyday practices actually run directly counter to and are hypocritical, essentially. And so for me, one of the things that I sort of took away from that was not only that we have to protest and refuse and withhold support from institutions that are being hypocritical, but that I think lasting change really has to make the alternative to that modus desirable, like what the alternative is to the status quo. We have to kind of make it so that it's more attractive and desirable.
Yeah, I love that point about alternatives, right? Because a lot of the focus so far has been on removing people. And like in media, right, we're about 3 or 4 years out from Me Too. There's still things that are happening. In gaming, they just had a wave of Me Too allegations and different things around power and structure and who gets to gatekeep and who doesn't. But the biggest thing that we notice as well is that you can remove these men from power, but the system kind of will continue to perpetuate if there isn't that reckoning that has to come with it. And that's the part that's been a lot harder, right? If there's individual men that you can get on individual acts or individual people, let's just broaden this out because not all the perpetrators are men in some of these cases. Individual people who were doing these types of acts, it's much harder to change a system that would still allow that would still accept that type of money, that would still offer that person a fellowship. It's a lot harder to look at what we see as morality. And I think that that's been the biggest shift in the conversation in terms of, okay, what type of institution and then, you know, sometimes what type of nation do we want to be? And how are we, what is our ethical core? And if we start defining that in a different way than has been done, that's when we start seeing, I think, structural change.
Well, I'm just glad to be included in this conversation. You're really terrific thinkers. First, I want to acknowledge that Dr. Benjamin rescinded her acceptance to be here tonight over Snyder. And so this isn't just about what activists do on the outside, it's also about the responsibility of those of us on the inside who can be complicit in accepting certain norms that are unacceptable. And so I want to applaud you because that makes, I know firsthand that helped make a difference here in the outcome. But the other thing I want to say is, you know, what weds Epstein and Snyder together? And in this way, it's an invitation to the work that Rua has done in her work that we're going to talk about tonight. And that is that they are powerful, and to some degree, money shapes both a politician's career as well as Epstein as a donor. And the degree to which a conversation about inclusivity is really marketing for the purposes of a broader goodwill campaign. I mean, much of what diversity has passed for in the 20th century has been to drive consumer sales by virtue of convincing broader consumer base that, you know, we care about you too. Please buy our product. So when we talk about morality, I just think it's important to remember that the relationship of morality stands in stark contrast to institutions that are driven by moneyed interests. And of course, everyone's got a salary here and lights need to be paid, but the question is, where do you draw the line between how those moneyed interests shape decision making and the degree to which inclusion runs against any kind of formal change? It's really, I don't want to reduce it to money, but I do want to suggest that that plays a big part of this.
Very interesting. I wanted to, by way of doing a little bit of a general introduction to the work, talk to you, Rua, about these two new amazing books. So, Race After Technology is what I think Fred Moten would call an act of fugitive scholarship, which is to say that it is a playbook for the way that technologists and activists can seek each other out. So there's lots of citations, ways to connect, direct relationship between research and practice. And in seeking each other out, they learn from one another how to evade systems of surveillance. Most of the book has this surveillance undertone to it, where together they work to know these systems, expose these systems, and even oppose these systems. And the collection of essays in Captivating Technology, though, are very, very broad. And those tend to link carceral technologies that are being deployed already to classify and coerce specific populations. And the authors tend to question if there is resistance even possible, or can technology liberate us? I want to ask you to talk a bit about what motivated you to bring together this collection in particular, and what are some of the major takeaways, especially about the way that data is harnessed and activated, that perhaps are happening all around us, but we don't see them very readily.
Yeah, absolutely. So I straddle different fields, and so the main motivation was trying to bring together conversations that I saw happening in different corners of various disciplines. So the two main conversations I was trying to draw together in Captivating Technology were ones happening in the field of science and technology studies. And here I just want to shout out Sheila Jasanoff. I spent a year here as a fellow, and so thinking about the insights that grow out of STS and putting that in conversation with critical race studies and trying to bring together scholars who've thought about these things historically in terms of our contemporary moment, but also speculatively in the future. So the way that the text is organized and the kind of takeaways from that structure are that there are more traditional sites of policing and prisons and even plantations where you can see more explicitly how technology can be oppressive. So that's the kind of first section and the set of conversations. But then it comes into our contemporary moment and look at places that you don't necessarily think are sites of carceral technologies or oppressive technologies, like the digital service economy or philanthropies or retail industry, H&M and Forever 21, thinking about how, one of the chapters shows the very same tools and logics that are used by police departments are sold to big retail giants in order to surveil workers. And so those are the kinds of things where you see that both the tools and the logics of surveillance jump ship. They scale the prison walls in many ways and are infecting so many of our institutions. But then through the conversations with the contributors, and this is, I think, the thing that I learned most from putting together this volume, is that I didn't eventually just stick with diagnosing this problem of race, technology, carcerality, but I was pushed by one of the more senior contributors to think about now what. And so what happened was I was fielding titles for the text, and I had some really bad ones, and they were very honest with me, like, it's not going to work. And this one individual said, in the way that you're framing this text in the title, you're giving a lot of intellectual space to diagnosing the problem that you set out to, and giving almost no space for trying to envision what an alternative would be. What would a more liberatory approach to technology look like? What has it looked like? And so in that exchange with this individual, where he said, you know, we in general, as scholars, tend to cede a lot of the intellectual space to naming what we don't want in the world, rather than naming and opening up conversations and space for what we do want, actually seeding the alternatives, the many alternatives that we want to flourish. And that pushed me both not just in terms of the title, but to really flesh out this last third of the book, which is about how groups that have been oppressed have always resisted and reimagined these practices from the top. And so, you know, you'll find in that last section, you know, both historically and in terms of our contemporary moment, ways in which all different types of groups around the world even redefine what we think of as innovation, you know? And so that especially is what I hope readers, especially students, will take away. It's a kind of energizing space around seeding, S-E-E-D, the alternatives that we want to see.
Excellent. And Khalil, you've also written extensively about the history of incarceration and the condemnation of blackness, and talked about the transition from slavery to the carceral state. And I can see this through line of, you know, there's moments where the technology sort of jumps the prison wall. And we were talking this morning, Chris and I, and he kind of blew my mind where he just said, you know, a Fitbit and an Apple Watch are just an ankle monitor. And I said, uh-oh, right? And as we looked around the room, and we had a moment too where Sadiq and I were like, uh-oh, you know, we love our stuff, right? But are we, in a way, creating that data, surveilling ourselves? And I love, one of the concepts that you bring up is the concept of the racial data revolution, and you really bring statistics into the conversation about making up people. And so can you talk more about this racial data revolution as you've understood it historically, and what it might have to do with the way in which our lives are turned into data today?
Sure. So just a basic definition of terms, just because I think it's important for me to sort of put my work in conversation with the present. And that is that big data is little more than administrative data that the state produces by virtue of registration, voter registration, getting a driver's license, God forbid you get arrested, school records, all that stuff, when you fill out those forms from Social Security application on forward throughout the course of your life, has become increasingly accessible. It used to be literally analog handwritten cards, and it just took a lot of effort for people to collect that kind of information and do something with it. So harnessing what we all leave behind, the traces of our lives and the dimensions of our lives to one degree or another with computer technology is essentially what we're talking about here. Now, take us back 125 years when the nation was in turmoil over immigration, and all sorts of people were coming here from abroad, mostly at the invitation of business to make money because they needed labor. And African Americans were making a go at their citizenship rights, newly gained in the wake of the Civil War. Social scientists set about to the task of trying to define who was worthy and who wasn't. Where should they fit in society? Who should be the hewers of wood and the drawers of water? Who should be the middle managers, the technicians, et cetera, et cetera. And in that era, demographers linked up with the kind of predictive sciences of that age and started to compile another version of big data. And they used what they had at their disposal. And what they had at their disposal was largely census data, arrest data. I fixated in particular on crime data as a real breakthrough. And the reason being is because one of the paramount questions in that early data revolution was, with population shifts on the scale that were occurring in the second industrial revolution, the question of how to efficiently harness people's labor power, but also to contain the social contagion their literal disease incidents, all these other social and cultural concerns about what they would bring with them meant that it was simultaneously about making money from their bodies and at the same time quarantining them in segregated communities. And that could be for the Irish, it could be for the Polish, it could be for African Americans moving from south to north. And in a nutshell, crime statistics became one of the most durable and important technologies of difference as a way of ranking people's relative fitness for citizenship, their relative fitness for being truly included in society. And so the higher the crime rates, the more suspicious and unworthy, labeled dangerous or part of the dangerous classes. And essentially, your individuality did not matter. Some of this led to eugenics and sterilization campaigns. Some of this led to immigration restrictions akin to the calls for closing the borders today, which did in fact happen in 1924. It's really striking the parallels with which the claim that data itself was divorced from any political agenda and was just a simple articulation of the facts of the choices that individuals made, that in some ways the rejection of a kind of biological argument, which in the past had been, well, these people are inferior because of the way they look or the way that their hair falls on their head, etc., to this is the way they behave, and therefore where they behave escapes the trappings of bias, and the data just accumulates of their behavior. But of course, the behavior was subject to surveillance, was subject to differential standards of treatment and justice, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing I'll say is with that data revolution, there was also a way out. So to speak to Ruha's point about the liberatory side of the story, is as much as crime statistics became a permanent stigma for black people as a way of disqualifying them from the full fruits of their citizenship and freedom, and essentially creating the conditions of mass criminalization which would eventually get us mass incarceration, that same data was inverted on behalf of those whose citizenship was a worthy enterprise of what we would call Americanization or assimilation. So some of the same groups in the 1850s that had been, their crime data had been used as a reason to contain, quarantine, or limit their full citizenship, say the Irish, by the 1910s and 20s became an excuse to help those same poor Irish people because we need them to be part of our society. Access to jobs in civil service work, policing, fire departments, the trades, construction, et cetera, et cetera. So in that story, in that early data revolution, we see that the choice of what to make of the data is our choice. The data doesn't tell us what to do. We interpret the data separate and apart from whether the data is a real reflection of reality or not.
So, Latoya, I want to invite you into this topic as well. Most of your work is much more contemporary, but even in looking for a current bio for Latoya, you've been talking on race and technology panels for at least a decade. when I was looking for your bio. But what is to say there is that you have been in the worlds of journalists and culture makers trying to struggle with this fine line between how do we put data in service of the culture and also how do we hold different spaces online for different kinds of discussion. And I want you to talk a little bit about the time when Racialicious was one of the most preeminent outlets on the net that were actually discussing these really important issues of race and culture and technology. And then you can wrap up by just telling us if we're doomed or not.
Don't ask the technologist for you. That's a terrible way to start. So to talk back about what we were doing with Racialicious, so Racialicious actually came out of a project called Mixed Media Watch. And that was started by Jen Chow and Carmen Van Kerkhove. And they were looking at how the media responded to mixed race people. And we realized that in mainstream media in particular, like the depictions of mixed people in pop culture, the depictions of people of various racial backgrounds were clearly problematic, but we just couldn't see or hear a lot about what was happening, what was supposed to, how you would even respond. And this is before you saw terms that were used in the media now, like toxic masculinity or racial identity. This was still in the middle, kind of with the backlash to political correctness, right? So we were still on that sweeping backlash before we got to identity politics. And so we started this blog. All of us were writing in our real names, not because we felt like we were going to be famous or anything. We were just like, who is reading? Like, who cares about this topic? And it turns out people from all over the world were really interested in talking about how race was playing out in pop culture as a way to be very accessible about what was happening. We started noticing we started getting a lot of mainstream media attention. And so a lot of our stuff was getting quoted in the New York Times, and this was when they were still trying to, like people inside of the paper were trying to establish things like race beats or discuss race or to be able to do things. Like, please don't forget that the New York Times and other institutions frequently drop the ball, and still do, on racial coverage, frequently did things like failed to report on lynchings, or failed, I think Nicole Hannah-Jones had a project of just like obituaries that were never written for people who were notable, but because of their racial background, their gender background, they just never got the credit that they deserve. So they've been rewriting and adding to the Times' archive for like these significant bios that were missed. So there was a lot of kind of editing within the media at that time, and there was a lot of control of the narrative. So those of us in the blogosphere, and it wasn't just racialicious, right? There was Sepia Mutiny, there was Feministing, there were all of these other places that were trying to talk back to the media. One of the first places I wrote for was Bitch Magazine, which is a feminist response to pop culture. All right? And so all of these things at this time in 2008, when blogging was becoming prominent, where bloggers were trying to get credentialed at the DNC, so you saw that with like Talking Points Memo, the first time they won the Polk, like all of those things were still considered very new media, very radical, very strange. And we just happened to be kind of on the forefront of people wanting to have a deeper conversation about race and accountability that they could use in the media and discuss it. So we wrote quite a bit of things that got a lot of responses. Remember, Diplo came to the blog and got mad because we were like, quoted himself calling himself the Christopher Columbus of like techno music. He got really angry at us for that. There was a time when we were talking to Vanity Fair about, I think they were talking about Madonna in this really strange way. This was when she had her like the Malawi project. And we talked about neocolonialism and what that looked like. And so it really allowed us in the blogosphere to be able to speak and influence what was happening in mainstream media in a way that I think none of us really anticipated. And at the same time, we were also dealing with the rise of white supremacy online. And this is, again, like white supremacy has always been with us. Like we've talked about this for years and years and years. It's just that like racial terror tactics migrate. And so back then it was Stormfront, now it was the Daily Stormer, it's moving to Vote and Gab, it just keeps migrating. But it's the same tactics you see over and over. You see the same charm offenses, whether it's the Ku Klux Klan leaving bags of candy with messaging, saying like, oh, we're your friendly local knights, we're here to help you, right? Targeted specific audiences. To when you go online to the mimetic warfare, Joan, that you talk about in your work, where they leave at college campuses like little memes, just, it's okay to be white. Determining to like provoke these types of responses. So we've watched these things migrate and morph, you know, over time, become more sophisticated, become almost in some ways more institutionalized in an interesting way. One of the first articles somebody had pointed out to us was we had a, sorry, I should mention, Racialist was a group blog. We did not run for profit. It was all just kind of everybody's volunteer love and labor. So whatever was on Racialist was basically someone had sent us in an article or asked us to look into something. And we had one person who was very tech savvy. This was 2007 or 8. So at the dawn, before SEO was a known term, before search engine optimization became like the business it was. And he wrote and he said, LaToya, can you guys do something on white supremacists using SEO to hijack Dr. King's legacy? Because they were going through and like messing with search rankings, messing with different things to try to reroute people who were looking for information on Dr. King into these white supremacist sites that were created to look like they were sympathetic to civil rights, but really then to tell you the truth about what was happening. And the truth is, again, to recruit. We saw that later at another Data and Society jam that I think it was Dana Boyd and Baratunde Thurston, who did about data voids and how white supremacists started working on looking at places where there wasn't a lot of good information about a place or, you know, some kind of city or type of event, and then filling that gap in with misleading information. So it's interesting, there's that, I don't know if I told you this story. It's a horrifying story, I'm gonna apologize in advance. So one of the pieces I'm known for that I wrote is called The Not Rape Epidemic. And it was about a incident that happened to me and some friends a long time ago, where basically a group of boys that I knew went to jail for a really horrific gang rape that happened when I was about 14 years old. One of the guys was my friend. One of the other guys who's in there was a person who had sexually assaulted me. And so there was all these machinations. There was a whole trial. There's a lot of things that happened. They were all tried as adults at about from 14 to 16. They've all been in jail for like the last 20 years. They just got back out. And what's interesting, that story had this weird half-light. So I wrote about it. It's in this anthology called Yes Means Yes, Visions of Female Sexual Power in a World Against Rape. It's floating around online in different places. You can find it pretty easily. But what's interesting about that specific story is that specific rape case that I wrote about all those years ago because it was happening in my neighborhood, it was right down the street, is now being used by white supremacists to recruit because of the racial makeup of what happened, right? So it was essentially 6 young men of color and 1 white girl. And because the Washington Post and other reputable newspapers put their archives behind a paywall, it created a data void and allowed white supremacists to then refer to this case without you having to actually see any facts, without you being able to access it without paying. And so they've now changed this narrative in terms of this is one of many instances where they talk about black on white crime and all the different touchlines and tags that they use. So it's been this weird half-life of this case throughout my life from 14 to now. That it just keeps resurfacing. But we keep seeing these tactics, right? Moving from offline to online and getting more and more sophisticated as it goes. So, being on the front lines of that and looking at how technology can be shaped depending on how you want to wield things has been fascinating. And then with data, right? So I'm in entertainment by choice, right? That's my profession. The amount of information, the amount of things that people try to sell me as an innovator on what I can learn about my audience, what eye tracking software can we buy for you? Oh, are you in games? Let's talk about emotional manipulation of your players. And how much data do you actually have on any one given person? And that's what led me to, there's a project I soft launched at the Black and AI workshop at the Neural Information and Processing Systems workshop, this big AI conference called AI in the Trap. And the whole idea, the whole genesis actually came out of a data and society conference called Future Perfect, where they were, that's Ingrid's thing. And they were talking about all these different modes of understanding artificial intelligence and surveillance, and looking at how surveillance culture has evolved. And they were talking about how Taser, as a company, has morphed into an AI company now. So now they're Axon, right? I think I was at the Harvard Business School Tech Summit and actually showed the ad for Axon for how they're positioning their stuff in terms of a whole smart police force, smart home, no more paperwork, scan someone's ID instantly. You can instantly correct news media reports. I found that really, really interesting. So Axon has this whole campaign that they sell directly to law enforcement. They're not putting this on the open market. This is sold into law enforcement. And they just have this idea of this vision of the future where every cop is Robocop. That was in their investor documents. And we all went, did we watch the same movie? Are you serious? Every cop is Robocop. And so at the time I was listening to Future in the Weekend and I was learning about artificial intelligence for work. And I was just my God, who in AI is repping for the low life? Who has actually been on the other side of law enforcement, has been through the system in a way that was not positive, and is looking at the way in which you design technology? So even the whole framework of stop snitching versus Silicon Valley's all snitching at all times, right? Looking at different types of modes of what would happen if technology was designed by the people most impacted versus least impacted. And Stephenie, who's an AI artist, her work also looks at that when she looks at juveniles that were diverted from the criminal justice system in her work with AI. You start seeing a lot of similarities around what could happen if we approach this from a different framework, and what happens when you approach this from a framework of people who've been targeted or prosecuted. You get a very different design outcome than you do if you are building from kind of a little bit more of the bubble that's normal.
Well, let me pick up on that point about the way in which we talk about the design process even. And we're going to only have a few more minutes, and then we're going to open it to Q&A. I'm looking for a Q here. So I don't see one, so I'm just going to keep rolling. Unfortunately, we were hoping to have Yeshi from Data for Black Lives here, but she couldn't be here last minute. But she has this very provocative slogan that is abolish big data. And of course, people cringe at that. Marketers are no, But the call to action isn't to get rid of data science, right? She says that she wants to, quote, put data into the hands of those who need it most, end quote. And for those who work in the culture industries, data can sometimes be turned into power. But one of the things that I think we're neglecting constantly in the way that we talk about how we tool and retool technology is narrative. Right? Narrative is the way in which we relate to one another. The way in which you position narrative in Race After Technology is to say that stories are the code for culture. And by way of wrapping up, I would love for us to talk a bit about some of the stuff that's been happening related to social media, disinformation, right? Everything was fine on the internet until 2015, just so everybody knows. And then 2016 happened, and the internet broke. I don't know if you heard this. It's like in the New York Times, right? So people along our lines have always thought, you know, maybe visibility is a trap. We want to be careful when we hand over information, but we also want to know when we're talking to the state, right? Like when I'm registering for something, I want to know who is getting that data and why. And then of course, like there was a big, like everybody's brains exploded when we found out that Russia was pretending to be transgender teenagers and Muslim advocates and black feminists. I mean, there wasn't a piece of the internet that they hadn't really astroturfed. And so I would love for us to conclude this portion of the discussion to talk about, if you could talk a little bit about the concept of the new Jim Code. And then Khalil, I'm very interested in hearing from you about disinformation and black activism, because I have a feeling the media's been lying on black people for a long time, and there might be some strategies you've heard about. And then LaToya, I would love for you to kind of close us out by talking a bit about how you're viewing narrative in glow-up games and the possibilities for redesigning culture through redesigning gaming.
Yeah, and it really picks up on LaToya's point about the sophistication, or what our colleague Jesse Daniels would call the fact that white nationalists are innovation opportunists. And so we're trained to think about racism as sort of what happens in the backwoods, as a byproduct of not knowing things. And so what our work is sort of troubling is the innovation aspect of racism, the fact that it's often forward-looking. And so when you think about the new Jim Code, which is invoking at the same time this history of white supremacy and racial segregation, but also the code is thinking about how the sophistication in enabling new forms of stratification and hierarchy, speeding up the possibility, making it easier. So a quick example would be, you know, thinking about kind of old school targeted advertisements, which are, you know, think about housing developers in the mid-20th century that put up flyers in neighborhoods like Leimert Park in Los Angeles, which is where my grandparents moved. And so these flyers would be trying to entice white home buyers by saying, don't worry, buy in this neighborhood because we have beneficial restrictions. We're not going to let black people move here, so your investment will be secure. And so this is a kind of old school targeted ad, which is now enabled through the back door of various, you know, Facebook, Google, in which advertisers can actually target and say, we don't want black people to see this ad, or we don't want old people to see this ad. And so this enables this old school kind of this discrimination, but in a new form where the people who are being preyed upon or excluded don't even know. So you can't even point to the racist realtor, right? Because you don't even know that you're being selected out of a particular group. So this is an illustration of the new Jim Code that's both invoking this history, but saying that it actually enables new forms of discrimination right under our noses, and we need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, there's so much more to say, gosh, because Ruha's done some really great work. So disinformation. Well, of course, the lie of black inferiority may be the greatest disinformation campaign of the last 400 years, as some of us have been talking about with the 1619 Project. What's fascinating is that one of the key elements of that disinformation campaign has been, as LaToya has already talked about, is the use of black crime statistics as a mobilizing tool to simultaneously stoke white fears of a Mexican rapist class of immigrants flooding the borders, building on an old and entrenched notion of black criminality. And at the same time, these tropes were used to discredit Black Lives Matter activism itself, which became a lightning rod for supporting the Republican candidate in the 2016 election, who made a platform based on law and order. None of us on this stage can overstate the case that the disinformation about Black Lives Matter not only was coordinated by some of the same people that LaToya has described, but also by Russian bots who use the fragmentation, the legitimate critiques against the state, as a way to create a wedge which both, as someone so brilliantly described, trafficked in digital blackface, which was to caricature the Black activists as unreasonable, crazy lunatics who hated white people, and at the same time to create a legitimate federal response in the Black Identity Extremist Report. So you have these ripples of actual every strand of our society. I mean, if we just take stock, one step back from the creation of a Black Identity Extremist Report linked to the digital blackface of Russian bots and white nationalists who are caricaturing the threat of Black and brown people in this country. And then we think about the overall outcome in our electoral arena. You couldn't center the consequences of this any more significantly. You can't pick any other aspect of our society and say, well, that whole, race and crime thing is not really important. We should be talking about these other issues. I mean, it is front and center. So the question of how are Black activists dealing with it and what should we be doing about it going forward? I missed one other quick point. The attack of white supremacists on innocent people also meant that disinformation disenabled our federal officials from seeing the real problem that faces us, right? Created a fake problem. Okay. So what do we do about it? It turns out that some of the resistance to what was going on was only made possible by virtue of Black people being in some of those social media spaces and seeing what was inauthentic language, a kind of fake vernacular, like literally seeing the cork smudge on the digital face of these white actors, whether they were Russian or white nationalists, and saying, no, that's not us. And so the question for us is, what role do we play in insisting upon the very people that LaToya has described need to be at the table of our newsmaking, our digital platforms, our tech industry, which remain some of the most exclusive arenas. If those people are actually there to see what's happening on these platforms, we could expect greater scrutiny and more vigilance on the front end rather than on the back end.
So the answer is include more Black people in newsrooms and in the tech industry.
Go figure, right?
I know, but it's, I want to say it very plainly because it rings true, right? Every time it happens, every time you introduce a different voice into the room that says, wait, why are you doing it that way? And do you see this other thing? It's like, they're like, wait, what? There's a different story here?
Although I would say not just inclusion, but power.
But power.
No,
they have to be able
but
to
you
say
don't have
something.
any power to say anything.
Yeah, that's
Your
true.
inclusion can be tokenized to say there's nothing to see here.
That's very true. And that goes back to some of the points we were talking about, changing the system and the structure so that it isn't just the one person in that room and in that arena. And I think that social media also, in some instances, introduces a kind of clapback, but you have to create such a massive wave to do that authentically that it sometimes feels like an insurmountable problem, and it's exhausting. So LaToya, I wanted to close out, and then we'll go into Q&A, just asking about narrative strategies in changing the way in which gaming culture and the culture is recognizing itself.
Cool. So before I go into that, I just wanted to quickly talk about the work of a colleague of mine, Terrell Starr. So Terrell is a Fulbright scholar. He lives part-time in Ukraine, and he wrote extensively about Russia's tactics of ethnic division when they were in Crimea. And it's amazing because he's an African-American writer and scholar, and so he just tweeted today, like, hey, news media, if you're looking for someone who actually lives part-time in the region, has experience in this, to be on air or to write for you, I'm here. It's been 6 years now that he's been talking about these issues and still not kind of mainstream and being passed over for other people who don't have direct experience. Experience was 25 years ago, and this is very common in media. Anyway, so just everybody now knows Terrell J. Starr. I think from a narrative perspective, one of the things to think about, I mean, and not just in gaming, but kind of where culture wars like to live. right? People like to seed culture wars with the youth. That's why college campuses are such prominent sites for trying to show racial division, for trying to do these types of activities. And that's why like gaming became such a hot topic. So Gamergate was huge for a long time. A lot of people really discussed what that meant. I think a lot of people didn't realize that essentially it was attractive to people who want to start a culture war because they felt like it was a lot of young men who could be radicalized in the same space, right? And you see this in varying spaces, right? So like a lot of the tactics that they use in Gamergate is also tactics that ISIS uses to recruit, right? When they want to recruit like young men from the Middle East. It's really interesting to look at patterns of radicalization and patterns of sowing division and seeing how actually similar they are. In the gaming space, in the gaming industry, it's been considered kind of like a young white men's space for a very long time, even though that hasn't really ever been true. And there have been quite a few people who've been here. So Glow Up Games is the first, as we know, all women of color founded game studio. And we were looking to change narratives, one, because we deserve to be represented in the things we play, all right? I think I gave a talk at South by Southwest back in like 2012, where I was like, oh, if I want to play, I've played as all kind of things. I've played as a leaf. I've played as an alien. I've played as all kinds of stuff. But if I've, like, in 30 years of gaming, I've been able to play as a black woman like 6 times. 6. I've been a white man countless times, right? Just thousands. I don't even think about it anymore. I can be a non-human way more often than I can be a black woman. And so I just found that really interesting. And then, like, I think after the panel, some folks online cobbled together like how many black female playable characters, and we came up with like I think maybe 17 still in like 32 years. So there's a lot of change that can be done, right? But the whole idea is to always watch the narrative, right? What is somebody selling you? This whole idea of Gamergate, of trying to pit gamer against gamer, was saying, well, these people really aren't you, right? They're not real gamers. They're social justice warriors. They're trying to infect what you love with like all these weird tactics, all this feminism, all this crap that we don't need. We don't need that in our games, right? We don't want a black lead character, even though that broke records as Grand Theft Auto, right? CJ and San Andreas are the most popular characters. But this idea of this narrative that there's an us and there's a them, and that we need to keep them out of our stuff is a thing that you see in housing policy and criminal justice. You see this over and over and over again. So when we talk about narratives and we talk about like what narratives are being allowed to proliferate in different spaces, all right? These are the things that you have to watch, because those fringe things, right? Gaming now rules the world just like comics rule the world. All this geek stuff that used to be very fringe has now come to center. And it's bringing a lot with it that people didn't anticipate or people didn't expect. So the whole idea of looking at narrative and narrative change isn't just about creating more equitable outcomes, but also kind of actively confronting the folks who would try to twist this and that whole idea of, racism and innovation, right? Yeah. Like racist innovation.
Is productive.
Yeah, racism is productive.
It's like it produces things, right? And so I think we have to reckon with that.
Right, and being able to directly challenge this, because a lot of times they're trying to go where we are not. And that is a huge conversation in gaming right now. Like in streaming, you have people who sit up for 4 hours. It's a whole different type of culture of like watching somebody else play a game for 4 hours because you're attracted to their personality, you're attracted to who they are, you want to talk to them. And a lot of this stuff can be the most toxic, ridiculous thing that's unfiltered, unedited stream for 4 hours. So the question that we all have now is kind of
like a golf outing.
Yeah, I was like it can be like a golf outing, right?
So
this idea of like
we're going to have a couple more minutes for questions.
Oh yes, let's
I know my friend here in the front wanted to ask one. If you could go up to the microphone over here. Yeah, way over there, please. I appreciate you signaling me that you.
And I just want to say that is Professor Dr. Evelyn Hammonds, who is one of the leading scholars of science and technology.
Right here.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm very persuaded by the conversation that resistance is not futile. But what I've really gotten out of this conversation, but is the resistance visible? All the different things that you all are speaking to, I don't know if my 16-year-old son and all his friends and most of the students I teach here at Harvard know about the reality of resistance. Because what I hear as I drive my son and his friends around is, but Mom, loss of privacy is the price we pay for progress.
Yeah.
Yikes.
What's the problem with losing privacy?
Yeah.
Right? And what you all have explained, the price we are paying for losing privacy, losing control, having other people collect so much information about us, the crisis of data. But who knows about this resistance?
Yeah. I mean, that is really, it's interesting the way you frame the question, but I realize as you frame it, that is what motivated me to write Race After Technology, because I wanted to make visible not just the problem, but all of the community organizations, all of the national networks, the various kind of pedagogical interventions that are trying to coalesce around a movement to address various kinds of coded inequity. And so I do think it can all be happening under our noses, but part of it is to bring it to light and also to connect the dots so that the various engaged scholars here in Cambridge are connected with the community organizations that are doing tech justice work, that are working with the artists that are sort of reimagining our relationship to technology, and really connecting the dots around this so that, you know, the generation who lands in my class every year, right, sort of for the first time thinking about the relationship between race and tech, has a language to be able to critically engage. I feel like we spent a few years really hyping up all of the coding for marginalized groups, girls who code, black girls code. And so it was like building up the technical proficiency, but what we really need to accompany that is a critical language, a critical conceptual tools that go along with that technical prowess, because just knowing how to sort of, you know, be a cog in the machine without being able to question it is really not going to serve us.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say quickly, I met Ruha and Joan at Data for Black Lives, which the last couple of years has been at MIT, D4BL.org for anyone interested in it. And they're tech ethicists. I mean, it's an entire ecosystem of resistors who are building capacity and building community. Yeah.
And just on the note about that, I did find out that the Data for Black Lives conference is going to happen next year in the summer in New York City. Oh, so two of my least favorite things together with one of my most favorite things. So do look out for that, because the registration actually moves pretty quickly. It's usually 2 or 3 days, and
it'll be closed.
It'll be closed because a lot of people want to support the organization, so they buy tickets even if they're not going to go. And so but I agree that we should understand that there's an organizational logic to resistance, and joining organizations that have some durability and some infrastructure and some principle are something that the moment of 2011, 2012 maybe underserved different populations online, because it was so easy to activate. It was so easy to get people in the streets. It was like every week it was like, you know, shut down Chick-fil-A, and then it was like Occupy. Then it was, you know, and so it was really easy to mobilize, but people weren't building the infrastructure and the durability. And there needs to be a return to, I think, some of these organizational logics. And anybody can start that, right? And that's the thing about the internet that's still beautiful in that way. I also wanted to, up in the back, you have a question at the mic?
Hi, my name is Lyle. I'm a junior at the college. So I'm currently in a class on the history of technology, and we've talked just today about this idea of technology as a social construction, and that like its role and use depends on the social context in which it's created and disseminated. And I just noticed a lot of kind of indirect connections tonight, and like showing that our country's history and our current society very much influences the way data and the internet and gaming is used and like constructed today. So I'm curious to hear thoughts as to whether you see technology going forward as simply reactive to our society and its values, good or bad, or do you think that there is a way that technology can be used to meaningfully drive social change for the better?
I mean, to me, it's always both, right? Like, technology tends to migrate, right? So even the people who create something, like the creators of Vine. The creators of Vine were like, oh, we want this stop motion loop video, and everybody's gonna be doing stop motion videos. And Vine became this totally different ecosystem that's now like migrated. The TikTok has its own pattern, language, speech. Like, it becomes very different. And so even when like people who create technology feel like they're shaping it, as soon as it hits society, it becomes something completely different. And so it can be used to push, but in the same vein, it's always also used to pull. So even like, we were talking about Fitbits being like ankle bracelets earlier, right? There's this wild article in Wired about basically someone who got prosecuted based on Fitbit testimony and a Nest video. And they prosecuted this guy for like his daughter-in-law's murder over basically debt to those two pieces of information. I find that really, really fascinating. And again, that wasn't like, nobody who set out to create the Fitbit was like, we're going to use this in criminal prosecution. But like, that's what ended up happening. So it's interesting because technology always takes on a life of its own, kind of like societies. It always takes on a life of its own, and it decides what it's going to be based on the user base of what's going to be there. So it's interesting because there's some collective action, and people feel like, oh, if we limit Facebook, we ban Facebook, we can restrict these big tech companies, we can break up big tech. But the way that these things actually implement in society, and when you see people actually using it, it's a much more complicated, much harder to police issue.
Yeah. Anybody else want to? I'm giving you all the last word because it hit 7 o'clock and I am bound by house rules for IOP to shut it down. So I guess by way of closing, this conversation has brought up for me a lot of hope and promise that even though we do have sort of a technological monopoly going on related to some of the larger platform companies, there are people here creating new culture, creating and being part of different circuits of power. And one of, I think, their greatest hopes for when the internet was designed, that it would decentralize some things at the same time that corporations and money would figure out how to centralize other things. And so, rather than inspire you to leave and become the next YouTube star, right? The point here is to go out and experiment with technology. Go out and try some new things. Look at technology critically. Understand that technology uses you as much as you use it. But at the same time, it's not going away. It's not going to be a boycott. This is a slow revolution. Right? We're in the midst of an information revolution. The printing press turned us all into readers. The internet has turned us all into authors. And so with that, I would like to say, go forth and read and write and learn, and don't go work at one of those companies.
No, we talked about that.
Thank you.
Did you want us to chime in?
Yeah.
Oh.
Do you?
That sounded like such a great ending, but she still wants us to chime in.
I know, just a little bit.
So
I
guess that my closing sentiment would be oftentimes when you hear these ideas, the first impulse is to think about what you can do individually different. And I think that's fine. But the impulse to only think at the level of individual change, I want to push you to think about collective action and organizing. One of the most heartening things for me in the last few years is the organizing happening among tech workers themselves, but there's organizing and collective action happening all around. And so you think right here in Cambridge, you think about the Design Justice Network at MIT, Professor Schock, you have the Algorithmic Justice League. So rather than trying to invent something new as part of the solution, connect up with what's already happening. One of the not so heartening things that I've also noticed is that tech bros are trying to establish centers of ethics, and so kind of taking the ideas that have long been there in terms of STS and then fancying themselves as offering the solution to the problems they've created, rather than linking up with those traditions, disciplines, organizations that have long been in the trenches. And so rather than trying to come up with your new startup for tech ethics, connect up with organizations that already exist and support them.
I'm going to give you a round of applause, too. We're all getting individual rounds of applause. Khalil, closing sentiments.
So I wanted to close on thinking about a kind of cautionary note about the glamorization of tech. I mean, so many of you are here for a reason because you have, you have concerns, you have questions, but a lot of people aren't here. And there's a lot of sexiness about turning to technology and innovation as an expression of solving some of the world's complicated problems. This is at the heart of Ruha's book. But I wanted to mention that, and to come full circle, that venture capitalists are not going to make you rich off of your anti-racist feminist app to root out all the white supremacist men in your life. So you have to make a choice about this kind of work. And you have to figure out how to measure success that is not dependent upon some economic metric. Because you pitch your idea and some rich person or even a wealthy philanthropy is not invested. That may not be the measure of whether it's a good idea or not. And the more of you come to a community of people who can collaborate and share resources to get those apps off the ground, or whatever they happen to be, the more likely we are to move the needle. I mean, something like Copwatch. I mean, if you think about the app Copwatch, which has, I mean, some people maybe never downloaded it, but it was an expression of the role of cell phone video in documenting police violence and abuse over the last several years. And so Copwatch, it didn't make anybody rich. But it did empower people to be ready. And this was not about every shooting of an unarmed person. This was the simple roughing up of a 15-year-old who was coming home from school by an officer who decided that his white T-shirt was too long across his body. So I just wanted to end that you can't let the market continue to dominate your own agenda and ethical code about what's valuable or not in our society.
Yeah. Amen.
All right. I think for me, the one takeaway I'd love for everyone in this room and about watching the live stream to take would be anytime you encounter a new community, technology, a new piece, ask yourself, what am I not seeing? What is something that's underlying here that I'm not seeing? If it's a new technology, what's the way that this actually works? Who's benefiting from me doing this, right? The whole like, take this test and then we're going to steal your face and then put it in the recognition system. Like that to me is fascinating. Same thing with like things that you just may not see. Like who is missing from a space? So like when people talk about projects like cataloging 4chan, and they're like, oh, we're going to look at the history of internet memes. It's like, well, 4chan is a white supremacist space. You'll notice there's no black faces in any of the memes that they put up. That's intentional. That's not an accidental oversight. Right? But if you're looking at this as like the memes of the internet, you're going to miss all of the Black, Latinx, everybody who's not white, because it's been excluded intentionally. What am I not seeing in this space? What is being hidden from me? How does this work? If you start asking questions, you end up in some really odd places, I'll tell you from experience. But just like, this is just basic journalism training, right? Keep tugging. You find out all kinds of things you never thought you could know.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
With that, I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight, and that's a wrap.
Awesome. Thanks, Joan.
Appreciate it.